You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestel. This week, we return to the world of the paranormal in the company of Scottish parapsychologist Evelyn Hollow. This year has seen Evelyn involved in the BBC Radio 4 show The Battersea Poltergeist, and due to her diligent and forensic analysis of the paranormal phenomenon at the heart of this case, Evelyn has become a shining light of reasoned investigation. We discuss her work on the show, the cultural aspects that often see paranormal witnesses dismissed due to the alleged prism of enlightenment, her personal haunted history, some cursed objects, and much more. It was a pleasure to discuss several topics with Evelyn, and I have no doubt that due to her intelligence, knowledge, and eloquence, we will see her star continue to shine. As always, you can click on the show notes to sign up for our Patreon for $4 a month to get access to early episodes and the new bonus content of the Paranormal Archive. You can also find Mysteries and Monsters across all social media platforms: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and please subscribe to the channel on YouTube. You can also find the website, of course, at mysteriesandmonsters.com. Thank you as always to Dean Bestel for his marvellous artwork. The show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys, and Mysteries and Monsters is delighted to be a part of the Straight Up Strange network. Now, let's join Evelyn to push our understanding of the paranormal in directions we may never have previously considered. My guest today is Evelyn Hollow, a Scottish paranormal psychologist and writer specialising in the history of the paranormal and the interactions between quantum physics and consciousness. A former lecturer at QMU, she now consults as a paranormal expert, most recently as part of the marvellous BBC show, The Battersea Poltergeist. Evelyn, I am delighted to welcome you to Mysteries and Monsters. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
First of all, I think we'll get the elephant in the room out of the way first of all. The Battersea Poltergeist has been a cultural paranormal phenomenon, I think, in these dark first early months of the lockdown, or lockdown 3, depending on where you are in the UK, that really seems to have caught the zeitgeist. And even as someone that loves the spooky and the weird, I was taken aback by just how popular this show became.
Absolutely. It has been a phenomenon. It's really hard to measure the level of success, but at one point when we did a Q&A on Twitter, we were like a top trending topic on Twitter. It's just been absolutely crazy. And it really has altered the format of how we maybe go about investigating these cases or even doing it in terms of entertainment. And people have been incredibly obsessed with this case and are still debating it on Twitter now, even though the last episode went out like several months ago. It's just been phenomenal.
Yeah, I mean, I was really surprised when I heard Danny was going to cover this, because I was very fortunate to speak with Guy Lyon Playfair about 10 years ago. And I'm one of those people, I'm obsessed with poltergeist cases. And I thought I knew all the big ones in the UK. So during our conversation with Guy, he kind of said, oh, well, I'm amazed nobody's ever really done a real deep dive into the Battersea Poltergeist. And I know you've mentioned this before. I thought he was on about the one in the 1920s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there's two. Yeah, there's two. That was it. Funnily enough, when Danny first contacted me to do this show, and he mentioned it was a cold case from way back, Battersea Poltergeist. I immediately punched it into Google, had a look through some articles and whatnot, and read through it. And then it wasn't until later on, a couple of weeks later, when he mentioned that it was set in the 50s, I realised I had been researching the one from the 20s. The entire time, and I was like, there's two, of course there's two. And
yes, it struck me because I sort of dove into it, because even before I started doing the show, I'd got a nice collection of paranormal books from John and Ann Spencer and Peter Underwood and the like, and there was very little on this case even then, which I found even more remarkable now in light of the media coverage that occurred at that time in the 1950s, Evelyn. And especially because we had the wonderful book that came out in 2015, so the Poltergeist Prince. So I found it really odd that it's taken this long for it to really come to light, because I think it is such a remarkably documented case. It's baffling that it seemed to have just disappeared from people's minds.
Yeah, I found that really strange as well. The book by James Clark had also come out, and it's incredibly detailed.
Yeah.
But this case, the Battersea Poltergeist is to the best of my knowledge anyway, is the longest running poltergeist case in history. It spans about 12 years end to end, and the level of phenomena involved in it is astounding. But not only that, it was the volume of people involved in it as well, from all different backgrounds and sort of walks of life, all different social standing, all different interests in the case. So it's, in terms of the kind of psychology of what's going on in the case, it is very challenging to look at it as clear cut as saying, oh well, it was invented by someone else, or it was someone else's doing, or it was the house, or it was the specific object, or anything like that. Is incredibly difficult. I've just never seen a case have so many people involved, such an intense level of phenomena, so vastly documented as well, not just the house, but it's Shirley's place of work, taking place when Shirley wasn't even there. Just sort of following people around, and just the 12 years, Chibbett really devoted his life to this case, and I think it sort of almost cost him his health at the end.
Yeah.
It's just an unparalleled poltergeist case, and yet it's nowhere near. When we say poltergeist cases in the UK, I think people always think of things like Enfield.
Yeah.
And that's been really well documented. They've now won it. I think the second Conjuring film is sort of based on it. Things like that. It's massive. So what happened to this case?
Yeah, well, it's very similar as well in regards to Chibbett, because unless you really know who he is, or you've come across him before, he seems to be the forgotten paranormal investigator of the 20th century as well, because when I was speaking to Danny when he was on the show, we were discussing Chibbett's legacy, and he's another one. It seems as if this case was airbrushed out of paranormal history in the UK for some unknown reason, and we've lost a gentleman that had really well and interesting friends who were very well connected, very strange, some of them as well, and organised, early parts of British sci-fi, and had a deep love of the paranormal. And it's one of those aspects that the more you look at it, the more it makes you scratch your head and think, why did nobody know more about this until recently?
Definitely, and especially like saying about Chibbett, he, much like this case, sort of just disappeared into obscurity, which is bizarre. I think in one of the episodes on the show, I think I described Chibbett as, being like the Great Gatsby of ghosts. Yes. Because he knew absolutely everybody, and he was involved with some huge names in history, not just in terms of, parapsychology or investigation, but also just outright celebrities. And he has a phenomenal body of work and investigation. He's so interesting. And yet, when we think of members of the SPR, of course, we think of, Guy Playfair and perhaps Maurice Grosse and, Harry Price and things like that. And Harold Chibbett is really the forgotten, one of the forgotten cornerstones of, UK paranormal investigation. So I hope at some point maybe someone writes a book on him, because that would be incredibly interesting, or creates a series just sort of looking at it from Chibbett's perspective, like who was Harold Chibbett? Yeah.
I've got many a book that covers all kinds of things, and it is weird for me when I look at that period of history, because there's a couple of other really good poltergeist cases that occur in the UK during that period in the 1950s, Evelyn. And once again, I'm stunned that it seems as if something happened in the 1950s where people just didn't think anything of it. And it's interesting for me because it's kind of that cultural period where, if you compare it to what happened after the end of the First World War and the rise of spiritualism, it seems as though we had a slight uptick in regards to spiritualism, as you touch on in the podcast, in regards to some of the seances that were going on and the spiritualism that was being involved at the early parts of the case. And yet I'm not sure if maybe that had some kind of response to it, that people didn't embrace spiritualism as much as they did after the First World War, Evelyn, and it's that may have played into playing down some of these cases that happened post-Second World War.
Definitely. I think also saturation as well. That's kind of what we see at the moment, where people, there's two things that I currently feel are oversaturated and therefore don't create the same kind of sensationalism that they used to, and it's serial killers and poltergeists.
Yes.
We used to have these, serial killers, especially in America, would obtain this kind of like legendary status, and they'd be given a name, and the huge court cases, with hundreds of people outside of courtrooms and following it and obsessing about it in the newspapers. And we'd have the same thing with poltergeists or a haunted house as something very specific. People obsessing about it in the newspapers, people travelling out to get a glimpse, talking about it fanatically, and they achieve this higher status in history and in pop culture. And then now, I don't think I could name a serial killer in the last 10, possibly even 15 years. And in terms of modern haunting cases, the same pictures and sort of little bits and pieces sort of pop up. Someone captures a photograph of something and it gets a clickbait headline and then it disappears. But I can't remember anyone coming to me in the last sort of 10 years or so and saying, oh no, someone's moved into a house that has extreme poltergeist activity, because I think we have become so accustomed to these things, and we've become so obsessed with past cases that we sort of ignore what's happening currently, and we're like, oh, it's a haunted house, oh, of course it is, and we just sort of move on. Like we're so unfazed by it now that I think, particularly living in Edinburgh, which is the paranormal capital of the world, it's a city of ghosts.
Yeah.
I understand what happens for us because every single damn thing here is haunted. And so we're completely unfazed. Like I always say to people, if you go for a job interview in Edinburgh, one of the things you can ask them is, oh, what's the ghost? Because I guarantee you, every building I have ever worked in a variety of jobs has got a ghost story. So we're not that fast. But like UK wide, I just think, what happened? Is there a cultural shift where we've moved away from it? Like, do we ignore it, and is that why it's not reported? Or is it that we're so oversaturated with it that we just think we can live amongst ghosts and demons and be unfazed by it?
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I mentioned a similar point to Dr. Barry Taff, who's obviously very famous for being the investigator of the Entity case from the US in the 70s. And he was kind of saying he thinks it's down to paranormal TV and YouTube why we don't seem to get these cases anymore, because as soon as anything slightly bubbles to the surface, it's online, it's gone viral, it's been taken away from a real kind of ability for people to investigate it properly, Evelyn.
Yeah, definitely. YouTube in particular creates a sort of decentralization effect where if you were to punch into YouTube, like Paranormal Cases London or something like that, or Paranormal Cases Glasgow, and you might get a couple of specific ones that sort of stand out, but there's also a lot of problems with people just creating the most garbage content and then slapping it together on a clickbait top 10. So then when you watch through them, people are like, oh, this is guff, like it's rubbish, and just turn it off. Yeah. And so all the really interesting cases that require proper, parapsychological investigations kind of get mixed in with all of the rubbish. So people are just like, this is all nonsense, and they tune off from it. And they're all full of these like doctored photo headlines, most shocking, you'll never sleep again, sensationalist rubbish. And so it makes our job very difficult. And it's the same thing with conspiracy theories, because there are some that will, and certainly the last couple of years have come out and they've actually been true, but they're so embedded in so much garbage that it's hard to unpick what is worthwhile and what is really textured and interesting, not just scientifically but socially, culturally, everything, from all of the other rubbish. And YouTube in particular, I mean, it's great because everybody has access to all of this, and you can literally learn anything from YouTube. Like, what a phenomenon. Yes. To be able to learn anything in like 20 minutes. It's an incredible tool, but also at the same time it just means that everybody and their cousin, sister's dog's bird can upload whatever they want onto it, and much like Twitter, it's really hard to separate out the real critical and quality content from the garbage. And it's made our jobs very difficult, and it's also, I think, also kind of damaged the public psyche of how they perceive the paranormal as well.
Yeah, it is interesting because it's one of those aspects, because it's something that I've grown up with. I mean, I would claim, if you pin me down, I grew up in a haunted house, Evelyn. So, and I know you had an introduction into the paranormal through your family relationships with your mother. Had a sort of attachment to things, it would seem.
Yeah, she when I was a kid, it was just such a normal thing that strange things would happen, particularly to my mother, and she had no control of them, and she was very sort of logical and practical about them. So I never really thought, when things would happen that were anomalous or, say, supernatural, I never really thought of them as being odd or being a shocking incident. To me, they were just something that happened, and then we had to analyse what they meant or what we did with them. And as time went on and I got older, they would start to kind of things would happen to all of this, but particularly I think, me, my mother and my sister. There are other things in the family as well, but the sort of three of us, and it kind of drove me into being a kid who was deeply invested in science. I mean, like when I was 7, I wanted to be a forensic anthropologist stroke astronaut or something like that. Yeah. And I was always really keenly interested in science, and so to me it was like, okay, well, it doesn't mean that it's not paranormal and not supernatural, but there is probably a science to that. How do I go about analysing that and investigating that? And then that sort of pushed me into, it pushed me into psychology initially, but I was forensic psychology at first, and then I sort of swapped to paranormal psychology. And I didn't treat it as being like a shocking thing, but my mother has absolutely no reason to lie, and she never broadcasted it to anybody. In fact, when I was approached to do Battersea Poltergeist, and I started talking about these things with Danny, I had to go away and I basically asked my mum for permission to talk about our stuff in our family, because my mum didn't talk to really anybody. Talked to the people in the family about it, but she didn't really talk to anybody outside of that. She never broadcasted or anything, and she had no interest in doing that. And so I just wanted to make sure she was comfortable with it. And then when the show went out, she works for Sky, and when the show went out, lots of people that she works with were listening to it, and they would come back and be like, you talk to dead people? So her boss, who's like head of a huge part of the company, was like a spirit talker, because that's my term for my mother, and she would be like, didn't know that. And my mum's like, obviously, wasn't exactly rolling about the office telling people she can talk to dead people. Yeah. And I just never treated it as being anything, false or shocking. It was just, okay, this happens. Why does this happen? And how do we understand it from there?
Absolutely. And I think that's a very interesting way to sort of view it, especially at such an early age, Evelyn, as well, because when I was growing up, we had a very similar thing. Obviously, other than living in a haunted house, my grandmother was a psychic and could count Doris Stokes as a close friend. So growing up, I was often awash with all these people coming to visit my grandmother, who at the time I had no idea who they were. They just seemed like a lot of lovely old people talking about things. And so growing up, I had that aspect of my life, but I also had that my father was a doctor of chemistry. So I kind of had a foot in both camps. So whilst I've often gone forward, and if you wanted to pin me down, I would say I believe in the paranormal, I'm not saying I know what it is, or I will even fudge into a category of explanation, which I don't think you can. And as our search for the knowledge and understanding of what could possibly be the source of this increases, I think you can't pin yourself down to a one-size-fits-all explanation. So I find it really interesting that seems to be a very similar kind of slant that you had on it, that despite this kind of culture of belief, you were looking at it through a prism of scientific exploration and as a more rational concept of understanding.
Definitely. I think I have two separate, I would say, two separate sort of frames through which I view paranormal phenomena. And my sort of personal frame is that I would class, I'm pagan, I'm Celtic pagan, and so I have personal sort of feelings about what happens when these things occur and what they mean. But I also, on the other hand, I'm a scientist, and therefore I have a different approach to, well, what causes this phenomena and where does it come from? And so I have to kind of work hard to separate them, because something that happens to me personally, or something that I interact with, or things that I do personally that are, you know, perceived as being paranormal, or interacting with paranormal beliefs, are something that links to on personal beliefs, and then outside of that, how I investigate and research and actually analyse, whether it's in a laboratory or through academic writing or otherwise, is two separate things. And the two camps can exist. They're not, people seem to think that they're mutually exclusive, like you're either a hardcore scientist and therefore you must be a skeptic, or you're a person who believes, and it's more like a set of like religious beliefs, and therefore you believe in everything. So if you believe in ghosts, you must believe in UFOs and psychic powers and crystal healing and scrying and so on. Yes. And that's not necessarily true. I think everybody has, you can, for me anyway, I am a scientist, but also a person who is inclined to believe, but it doesn't mean I go into every case being like, oh, that's definitely a ghost, or that's definitely, a poltergeist or anything paranormal. I have to still go through it with a scientific framework, because the point of science is to disprove things, not prove them. So we must go through, tick off, okay, well, it's not this, it's not environmental, it's not the house, it's not this person, it's not leaking pipes, it's not whatever, and so on and so forth. And then we go through it psychologically. Okay, well, it's not mental health issues, like it's not hallucinations, it's not untreated schizophrenia, anything like that. And then once we're able to clear that, we go, okay, well, is it paranormal? And therefore, if it is paranormal, how is that possible, whether it's in terms of quantum physics or so on, or anything else, and just hack through it. But there's a way to believe and still be scientific. And it's incredible how many people believe but sort of pretend they don't. It's like more than half the population of the UK believe in the paranormal in some form or another. And people have this idea that if they don't believe, then they are scientific and rational and intelligent, and people who believe are idiots and uneducated and so on and so forth, and things like that. And there's also I think when I discussed this on a Spooky Isles interview, where we talk about there's also a class problem as well, where people view those who believe in ghosts and things like that as being uneducated, and therefore it's something for the lower classes. You know, like they're so poor and uneducated that something happens in their house and they don't have the scientific aptitude to know that it's just X and not a ghost. And that's just not true. And there's imperialistic problems as well, at Western psychology versus any other psychology. And we, so we have to look at it from a psychosocial aspect. And we see in these cases like Battersea that these things happen to, working class people, in very working class in London. And then it sort of disappears. But I can guarantee you that if that had happened to a wealthy family in a Georgian townhouse, it might, well, first of all, it might have also been obscured, and the story might not have even come out, because those people would be feared to be seen as lesser. And also, if it did come out, it would be of incredible interest, because people view the intellectual capacities of people with money higher than those who do not have it. And it is a recurring problem in psychology that we think that people who believe, for whatever it is, whether it's UFOs or ghosts or anything else, is being, less intellectual and being ascribed to a certain class. And then we do the same thing where we do that outside of Western psychology as well, where, you hear cases of, beliefs in things, whether it's in Europe or in Africa or in India, and we just go, oh yeah, well, they're just, people are like, oh, it's third world, so of course they've just not reached, when they reach our status, they'll no longer believe, kind of, it's so arrogant. And incredibly, it's just stupid as hell as well. There's no, it just doesn't conflate with that at all, and it makes absolutely no sense. There's so many people I know who are, not just in terms of being educated, like on on paper. There are literally books by former head engineers in aeronautics at Princeton University, top class scientists in their field, who've written books about kind of the science of the paranormal and things like that. But then you also have people who've travelled, who are like socially intellectual. They've travelled the entire world. They've studied lots of different cultures, things like that. And they write books and definitely believe. And some of the most prominent people I know in the field of the paranormal are like retired, physicists and things like that. It's incredible to watch how people try to rationalise that and make that go away.
Yeah, I think it is very interesting when you look at it on a cultural aspect, Evelyn, because there's a very similar kind of framework that's often prescribed towards indigenous populations in regards to cryptids. Bigfoot and the Yowie are prime examples, because some people, if you ask them, will say, well, Bigfoot's a modern phenomenon. It only appeared in the 1950s. And as someone that loves cryptids, and especially Bigfoot, I'm so frustrated with that, because that is a prime example of just dismissing the indigenous population's stories, experiences, and history of alleged encounters with such creatures for centuries, Evelyn. That once again, that comes to the point that you prescribe to there. Well, what do they know? They're not as enlightened as us. They don't understand the world. They're just reaching for mumbo jumbo. And yet, you look at their cave art and petroglyphs and things like that, and you will see buffalo and coyote and wolf, and then there'll be a Bigfoot, and they'll go, oh yeah, well, they're all real, but that's just a dream. And you're like, well, how can you say that? Surely there has to be some kind of basis in this, and especially when it comes to the tribes of North America. I know we've gone slightly off tangent here, but I find it very odd, because you're talking about a culture that didn't write things down. It was all word of mouth, and this phenomenon stretches from the Mexican border all to the wilds of northern Canada. On every tribe throughout that continent has stories of hairy creatures of some description, be they large or small, Evelyn. And yet, the majority of these tribes would never have interacted, never met, never been able to pass these stories on, spoke different languages, and yet it's something that seems to be a constant throughout all their oral tradition and history.
Absolutely. And when you look at the sort of paranormal anthropology, there are various things in folklore that pop up where they do, like, as you said, they appear in various places throughout time across various cultures that had no way of interacting with each other, as we currently understand it. And therefore, how is that possible? So you have to look at, in terms of cryptids, is it that there is there's an animal sort of like basis for it? Is it there for something that's now extinct? You have to look at, was it something that was here before but it is no longer here due to the ecosystem or climate changes, things like that. And it's incredible that, I think to me paranormal, and that is everything from religious beliefs right the way through to UFOs to cryptids, a whole thing in between, is the one thing that is the central tenet of the human experience. It appears in every single culture, in every single type of person, in every single race, throughout the entirety of time, right the way back to the sort of first beginning, the first, writing downs, the first sort of recordings of history. It goes right the way through back. And we can sort of ascribe that in terms of psychology as saying, well, it's our desire to believe, but it doesn't always have to be in terms of religion, like belief in higher power, or therefore giving you a set of rules or structures or moral obligations, things like that. It's also just things like you said, like cryptids or experiences, whether it was possession or haunted places, curses, things like that. This goes so far back that there are points where we have to ask ourselves, how is it possible that throughout the entire history of time, this is sort of the central chord of us, and yet it's the thing I think currently we ignore the most? And as you said, like with the cave paintings, how can we point to several things in succession and say all of these are true, this one is not? And it's simply because we think for something to be created as a belief, we say that in terms of religious psychology, it has to violate certain principles. So it has to obey the laws of certain things, whether that's physics or chemistry, biology. It has to be like mineral, animal, object, artifact. But then it has to violate one of those principles. So you could have a statue, therefore that is an artifact. Maybe it's made of like iron, so it's a metal. It behaves like a statue in that it is still, it's very heavy, it doesn't move, it's solid, if you try to hit it, but maybe it cries blood. So it's belief violation. And that's how we understand it in terms of the psychology. But trying to define, like, whose idea was it to decide what violates what principle? Who came along and went, that's real, that's real, that's real, nah, that's made up? Like, who? I find that archaeologists tend to meddle terribly in history, and sometimes how we understand things currently is also wrong. I've constantly found throughout the history of like archaeology, they'd be digging up bodies and then mapping psychological and social beliefs onto them that are not true, and because they're written down by academics at the time, we take them as gospel, and then when we go back it's just their opinion being mapped onto it. Like archaeologists finding two bodies in a grave and being like, oh, well, these were two soldiers who were clutched together in fear at the end of war, and you're like, shut up, David, people were gay. Like, it's just, it's so white as well, some of it, because they didn't understand other cultures, so they would be unable to speak the language, and then they would project Western ideals and interpretations onto it. Even recently, cave paintings, like we were talking about, cave paintings often have what we call spaghetti lines on them, which is the lots of vertical, neat, exact lines that go over them. And for ages we thought that it was people trying to destroy them, kind of like ancient vandalism, but they were too organised and too structured, and also you can still, it's not like it's been scrubbed out, you can always still see the drawing underneath, and we could not work out what the hell these things were for until someone went into, I cannot remember the guy's name. He went to a cave. There's a very famous cave in France that has lots of very detailed cave paintings.
Yes.
Very well known. And he went into it, and of course, when we're excavating things, we use these big like floodlights, especially in caves. And he went into it, and one cave in particular he went to was very remote, and it was actually, I think, a farmer owned the land. So he went in with them, obviously just with like a lamp, like a lit, I assume like a paraffin lamp perhaps, and went in, and when he was standing in there, he suddenly realised the only light that these people would have had in the cave would have been a campfire, and of course a fire flickers, and when he swung the light back and forth of the lamp, he realised that the paintings move. They weren't trying to destroy the drawings, and they weren't any formations in the rock. These people, all the way back to Neanderthal times, had created moving images. They'd created like flick book effects by putting lines on them, and the flickering of the fire would cause the object to move. And we only discovered that like not even that long ago. These people were way more advanced. We think of these people as being so far back in history and unenlightened, and it's just not true. These people were actually really clever, and lots of them had technology or equipment or tools and things like that are very impressive, and we've lost so much of that history because it's been wiped out, either by not being written down or mostly by colonization and force and destruction, and also natural disasters and things. So these historians and archaeologists ascribe their opinions to things that they find, and then because it's written down in a book with some guy with a PhD's name on it, we're like, oh, that's gospel, and we never think of it as being opinion, or that this knowledge can change later on. And so I think, especially in terms of things like cryptids and anomalous, or even just like strange creatures like dragons and sort of folklore, we take our current knowledge as being gospel. And I think that if we were actually to go to these countries or to these places where these things exist, or there is history of them, whether it's cave paintings or scriptures, things like that, we'd actually find that the people there have a much deeper understanding and knowledge of them, and it's just either not translated to us, or it's just been sort of scrubbed through history because we think of their voices as not being important. Only us, big Western, big white voice is important, and it's just not true.
I think you only have to look at paleontology, which is a fairly recent scientific discipline as well, Evelyn. to look at what people thought dinosaurs were 150 years ago compared to what they are now. And even in the last 30 years, I mean, as a child growing up, dinosaurs were all lizards. Now, we know that's simply not the case, and the majority of them were probably the bird family. And our understanding and learning in that particular subject has developed so quickly in such a short space of time, maybe 30, 40 years, that I think if you got a paleontologist from the 1970s and brought him to the present day and showed him the academic understanding of the subject, he would probably be baffled by what people discussed and understood these days compared to the prescribed knowledge and understanding that this is what it is, there's nothing else to talk about, they're lizards.
Definitely. And even like the colour of skin, because that changed a lot throughout like dinosaur history. We just assumed, like sort of green and brown because it would be camouflage and things like that. We never thought of them as being possibly brightly coloured. And we're sort of just, mapping. I mean, they are informed, educated assumptions, but they are still assumptions.
Yes.
Unless we're able to back science with them. And so it's definitely, especially paleontology, it has changed a lot over the last even just decade or so, I suppose.
Yeah.
And it's funny how we do that with creatures. Like, I mean, obviously being in Scotland, like we have like the Loch Ness Monster, and people have looked at that. That is one of the ones that people vastly believe to be a dinosaur, some sort of big sea dragon, basically. And especially because the shape of it kind of looks like a water version of a diplodocus. And so most people believed that it was that. But then there's no access in and out of Loch Ness in terms of like water. So then where does it go? And then people started to look at cave systems and things like that. And when we go back far enough throughout history, there were animals and other species that don't exist now that would absolutely terrify. You only have to go to like the National Museum and look at the size of how big some of these creatures used to be. It's absolutely mind-blowing. So there are some things that were likely just creatures that no longer exist now, but then why do some things appear in other some things that would have to exist perhaps solely in this climate, would be adapted to this climate, are identically found in other cultures on vast other parts of the world that would have no way of getting to, and then you have to look at how then they interpret it as well, and then how that feeds back through folklore. There's so much going on, and I just find it so ignorant the way that people will, and it's the arrogance of people who think that they're enlightened. Just absolutely to look at these things and be like, but that's just like nonsense. And I'm like, well, have you ever actually researched it, or thought about where that comes from? Because it's very it's possible, but it's very unlikely that somebody one day was like, what I'm going to do today? I'm going to go out and I'm going to create an incredibly large myth of a giant sea monster, and then I'm going to maintain it for this number of years, and and all those sort of things, and do it. It does happen because hoaxes do definitely happen, and certain things have been disproved. But we're talking about a lot. We're talking about thousands of years. Yeah. And it's just deeply unlikely. I just find it an odd stance to take. I don't know how anybody can look at that and not go, I would want to know more about that, or where does that come from? Okay, well, if it is something that was real or is still real now, why that area, why that specific land, what is its purpose? If it's in an ecosystem, what is it consuming? What is it drawn to? Where did it come from? What does it represent? And then look for it in places, whether it's other art or writings or folklore or observations or things like that, and investigate it. But it's incredible. I just find it so strange that people will hear these things and be like, nah, it's probably fake, and just continue about their lives. I'm like, okay, your brain must I just think, massive smooth brain syndrome must just be like rolling tumbleweeds. Like, these people must be so happy as well. They must just be so, and they think that we're the stupid ones. Like, I don't know.
Yes, I've been called much worse as well.
Oh yeah, I definitely have.
I mean, it is interesting as well. Do you think, obviously, because you made the professional decision to commit career suicide, Evelyn, as I've heard you mention it, by changing from forensics to paranormality. Do you think that the fact that your first educational discipline was forensics in regards to the sort of improvement in how witness reporting and investigation could be dealt with. Do you think that's given you the framework and the tools to apply it in regards to parapsychology and give you a better grounding to deal with the evidence that is often put forward as proof of whatever is going on?
Definitely. I originally was an experimental forensic psychology research assistant, which is an incredibly long job title, for a couple of years under Dr. Mansour, who's a lecturer at QMU. Mm-hmm. So I was just sort of like a voluntary assistant to her, and we worked mostly in eyewitness testimony. That was our main area, and looking also at how that affects criminal justice and how do we actually not just interview eyewitnesses, but also how do they even make identifications and things like that. So I definitely apply that in a lot of like my current work. We do have to look at when events happen, do people then discuss it amongst themselves? And we have problems with memory where then when we ask them to recall it, well, what did you see? They're not telling me what they actually saw. They're telling me what they've been told they saw, or they saw an individual thing but maybe didn't see something else, and then they sort of absorb that information and then repeat it back to you, but it's not individually what they saw. And so cases become conflated and very difficult. We also have to look at, in terms of the forensics, we also have to look at your memory as being incredibly fallible and how much it breaks down over time, and the ways in which we repeat things so that they become true in our head. I've even found this to be something that can happen it does happen to you like in everyday life, but I even find, we're not infallible, I'm not infallible of it either. Sometimes you'll hear something and then I'll be like hosting a private tour and I'll be repeating it back, and then when I actually go back to my original notes much later on and look at it, there's, maybe there was a date that was wrong or a surname that was wrong, and you're just repeating it until it becomes true in your head. So that does happen, and we do have that issue in paranormal cases. So we have to look at, okay, well, who witnessed it? What did they actually witness individually? And then what did we collectively say was witnessed? And you have to watch how people use their language as well. People will say, oh, well, I saw this, I saw this candlestick levitate. Okay, well, what did you actually see? Well, you saw it hitting the floor. Okay, but did you actually see it, like in front of you, motionless, and then lift and then hit the floor? Did you just see it hit the floor? Some people didn't even see anything at all. They heard it. Yeah. Like they heard something hit the floor, and they'll say, oh yeah, well, the candlestick got thrown off the table. I'm like, what did you actually hear? So we have to be very careful in picking it apart and trying to make sure that we are getting the information that we are told correctly. Yeah. And I think just as an investigatory framework, I think that was right, investigatory framework as well of how we actually assess information. You have to be very careful about leading people. People would bring this up in terms of the Battersea case, or people talked about the fact that they felt that Chibbett was often kind of what we call leading the witness, and that he was creating prompts, or he was very, very obsessed with the theory or the belief that Donald was the lost dauphin of France. And, he was very, almost obsessed with this sort of theory, and he chased it his entire life. And people would say, okay, well, he's prompting that, he's embedding it in the case where it's not there, perhaps. So you have to look at us as investigators, because we're not separate from the case. When we're doing something, working on a case, or whether it's a cold case, or even currently now researching something just through notes, we ourselves are unable to be unentangled from the case. So we have to say, what are our biases? Like, what do we think that we're interpreting? And then how are we also projecting our feelings back onto it? And as a psychologist, you have to be very careful with separating yourself from what you're working on and separating yourself from the other people that you're working on, and step back and go, okay, well, like for me, I would have to say, am I inclined to believe this right from the get-go because I have certain beliefs, and do I need to stand back and disentangle that? So I work really hard to make sure I'm trying to be as unbiased as possible in the case, and that those things do not inform that, because even though I am inclined to believe, I definitely go to look at things or research things, or people tell me stories. I host a lot of private tours in Edinburgh, and people tell me stories all the time. I love them, but then I also, as I'm hearing them, I'm not inclined to go, oh yeah, that definitely happened right away because I believe. I will stand back from it and go like, okay, well, what were the chances? Like, how legit does it sound? And then ask for more information. But it is something that, like, I find that people will think, because I'm a person who's more a parapsychologist who is more on the believer side, that I will just believe anything.
Yes.
You know, I will just hear someone will tell me a story, their house is haunted, and I'll be like, yes, I love a haunted house, and just, you know, and instantly they'll be like, oh, well, you know, they could show me a smashed up room, and I'd be like, definitely a ghost, and it's just not true. But in the same way, on the other side, I find that skeptics sometimes do that, where I don't know if it's just because people assume that they're, you know, they're so rational and they're so logical, that, you know, nothing could fool them. But I also wonder sometimes if they don't work to be as unbiased as some of us do, because they go into a case automatically not wanting to believe. So no matter how much information they're given or proof or evidence, they're instantly from the get-go not interested in believing at all or being open-minded. So they're looking for the most ridiculous reasons to explain away some phenomena. Mm-hmm. And no matter how much evidence you give them, at no point can their mind be changed. And that is a bias in and of itself. Not believing is as much of a bias as being inclined to believe is. And I've definitely seen, there's definitely cases where people, so much has happened, and I think some people are unable to even open themselves up to being, okay, well, we've ruled out absolutely vehemently everything else. Could we even begin to explore this as a paranormal piece of paranormal phenomena? And they're just so shut off from it. And I don't know if it's because they're afraid, or if it's because it would require them to sort of recant their entire life's work, or if it would change them as a person. I don't really know why. And then, you know, so then they map their bias onto it, where they start explaining it away in these fantastical, convoluted explanations, but then very few people ever seem to, like, criticize that. They go, oh, well, yes, it must definitely be that. It must definitely be that. And I find that is as much of a harmful bias, and as, you know, as much against the kind of work that we have in forensic psychology as being a biased person who believes is. Like, they're both as bad as each other.
Yeah, I think it depends who's saying the theory, Evelyn. Like you were referring to earlier on about witnesses being dismissed, usually down to social status and class and things like that, and the lack of education, and therefore these people are just idiots who believe any old nonsense. And yet, what I've often found, as you refer to there, is often when you deal with a case, Battersea is a prime example, Enfield is another one, Pontefract is one that also often falls under this kind of umbrella, is that someone will explain one thing, and therefore that instantly dismisses everything else. And I find that kind of attitude very peculiar, that people will go, oh, well, they've said it's this, so everything's false, or everything's a hoax, or everything is down to this. And you'd think sometimes, well, ignoring evidence that doesn't fit the parameters of your explanation is as bad as accepting everything that's happening as paranormal.
Definitely, I find that to be retroactive.
Yes.
In that people will have, say there's a case with 30 very distinct events or things that happen, points in the case, and we can find, and one of them is maybe fairly weak, and there is likely, like 99%, there is likely a perfectly sort of environmental or physical, classical physics kind of understanding of it, and we'll talk about that or explain it. And then as soon as that happens, people then start applying that or ascribing it to other points in the case. Or they say, well, if that's explainable in terms of X, then everything else must be explainable in terms of X as well. And it retroactively undoes all the other points in the case.
Yeah.
We would sometimes see this happen in the Battersea case, where I would read through what people were saying on Twitter, and once they got to a certain point in the case where they felt that at least one part of the phenomena or a few things could possibly be explained by something, they would then just disregard all the other phenomena in the case right the way back to the beginning, like 10 years worth of just stuff just deleted instantly from their brain. Really bizarre. You can explain, like for instance in the Battersea case, like if you could explain away people wanted to explain away the noises, some of the tapping is perhaps Shirley doing it, but that doesn't explain away the fact that at the beginning of the case we had sounds that were something ridiculous, like 180 decibels, waking up neighbours flooding out the street in the middle of the night, thinking it was like the bloody Blitz, the police being called to the house, whole shebang. I don't know about you, but I can't click my fingers or pop a bone or whatever loud enough to have the police, come to the house because they think there's a riot going on.
Yeah.
And things like that. But as soon as somebody heard that's a possibility, they just sort of like, oh yeah, okay, it's definitely that. It's just that. It's only that.
Absolutely. I tend to see that happen in most poltergeist cases, that people will come up with some of the most ludicrous explanations, which are often more ridiculous than the events they're trying to explain away, Evelyn. I remember one part of the Enfield case at the beginning where a cast iron fire is pulled out of a wall, and I once saw somebody explain that an 11-year-old with a crowbar could have done it, even though it took two grown men to move it back into place.
And in the similar thing in the Battersea case, there was a point in a bonus episode where people had come to visit the house, and Shirley was sitting on, I think, basically like a futon, and she began to be pulled basically upwards off of the futon to the point where she was no longer, physically connected to it. So basically levitating.
Yeah.
And multiple, quite large, grown, strapping working men were hanging on to her, trying to pull her back down, and they physically could not. I don't know about you, but I don't know anything in terms of like classical physics or in our physical material current world that could lift a 15, 6, she might have been a bit older at the time, like a bit teenage girl, physically off of a sitting place with nothing connected to her spontaneously, and have multiple grown men hanging on to her trying to pull her back down with all their force, and they could not. And we're just like, oh no, that's like a breeze or something. Like, it's just ridiculous. And and we can, we do have to look at that in terms of, like, Kieran makes a good point in the case where at one point when Shirley's is said to have been levitating out of bed, there is, we talked about it, the fact that it could have been a seizure. Yeah. And he is right in saying that, well, what actually happened, did one of them thought they saw, because they were all, there was a lot of screaming and stuff kind of going on. Yeah. Did one of them say, okay, well, she was like levitating, and then the other one said the same thing? And that is true, that could happen. It could be that someone is pointing and going, oh my god, Shirley looks like she's levitating, and then they've all confirmed it. But at the same time, if that wasn't happening, if just somebody thought they saw, Shirley for whatever reason sort of looked like she was floating, if that was true, why would it still take 3-4 grown people hanging on to her to pull her back down? That means there is still a force being exerted on her. Yeah. So as much as we can sort of, in terms of the the sort of forensic eyewitness, explain away, okay, well, what you think you saw you maybe didn't see, but if in something in terms of where there's multiple people physically interacting with it at the same time, there's no way for me to, I don't know any, in fact, it would be more impressive than a poltergeist if 15-year-old Shirley was able to create all of the phenomena, or even half the phenomena that we had in the Battersea case. Yeah. That in itself would be more fantastical than poltergeists.
Yeah. Well, I've often said that because it's one of those, once again, one explanation seems to fit everything. In most famous poltergeist cases, when people try to explain them away, Evelyn, Enfield is a prime example. I think there's 1,400 incidents recorded, and some people seem to think that the two girls are the two most talented illusionists on the history of the planet, and the same thing would apply to people like Shirley, because there's such an amount of incidents that go on of varying types, from noises to movements to alleged levitations to apports, graffiti, sounds. I mean, one of the things that wasn't covered in the podcast, unfortunately, in depth is the piano, which is one of the weirdest aspects of that case. I mean, how did she make a piano play on its own then?
Yeah, exactly. There's the thing is, these cases are so, like you're saying, like with our case, the Battersea Poltergeist, with Enfield, Borley Rectory, the Black Monk of Pontefract, things like that these cases have so much phenomena and so many instances that they kind of get condensed down into the big ones when we either pick them apart or people adapt them into, TV and things like that. When we pick them apart on podcasts and shows, that people forget that they're only being given, X amount of information. And so they make their mind up based on that information, but then sometimes things are cut from it, which are even further inexplicable. So if you were to go through all the events that people heard just listening to the Battersea Poltergeist, and then you were to go away and dig into the case, maybe through James Clark's book, The Poltergeist Prince of London, and go through it, there is way more than we even touched on in the show. There's also, in a lot of the bonus episodes, we heard from people who'd found out about the show who were alive round about the time and then got back in touch with Danny to confirm things in the case. And just, the level of people that were getting in touch and how much it even just expanded the case in and of itself. Like the person whose sister had worked with Shirley, and it was like, oh yeah, definitely remember, like there was like scissors flying about the place and everything like that. So people at the time were just, in our show initially, when you hear it, you're like, oh well, scissors go disappearing, it's probably Shirley just nicking them, like she wants attention. And then you've got multiple people who are now, as though Shirley was 70 or 80 and are coming back and going, oh yeah, no, I definitely remember that happening, like this was an everyday occurrence, it was terrifying to go to work, things being thrown about. And they're confirming it. And then you go, okay, well, how did Shirley do that in a room full of people and so many witnesses and yet so much other phenomena as well, and things like, and then people wanting to ascribe it to being like, oh well, it was John the entire time. Right, well, John's not even there half the time, and also he moved to Australia like a year into the case.
Yes.
It's amazing, honestly, the level of abuse I got on Twitter from people just being like, it's ridiculous, it's John the whole time, the whole thing's John. And I'm like, he moved away like a year and a half into the case or something. So, like, people are so desperate to latch onto one explanation and then use it to explain away absolutely everything.
Yeah.
And yeah, like you say, like with the piano or like the cast iron fire and Enfields, objects that, in these cases, objects that are not possible for a person to have moved, or not without, it would have taken them a long time, and it would have been instantly detectable. Like if you drag a piece of heavy furniture across a set, like wooden floors, and what is a very small house, because both Enfield and both Battersea were quite small houses, drag them about, instantly that's, someone's going to catch you doing that. Like how were they able to do that without being detected, with often dozens of people in the house, investigators, reporters, police officers, family members, neighbours, what, nobody noticed? It's just, the amount of phenomena that happens in these cases, and you're like, explain that, and then people just sort of ignore it, and they're like, but I explained this other little thing here, so therefore I have explained all of it. I'm like, right, okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember once, because obviously where I live in Sheffield, Evelyn, our most famous haunted incident is the Stocksbridge bypass, and I interviewed somebody who then told me after we'd finished chatting that it was their friend who had done it, which made no sense at all, because if you lived 30 miles away from Sheffield, you wouldn't know where Stocksbridge was, for the first thing. Secondly, why would you decide out of the blue to turn up at a development of a bypass to pretend to be a ghost for no reason? There's no history of hauntings in that area at all. And then when I pointed out that the police officers reported this incidents as well, they were like, oh well, they were probably just overreacting. And I was like, well, none of that explanation. It's one of those explanations that makes less sense if you know anything about the case.
Oh yeah, it's amazing how many like when people give forth ultra skeptical, deadpan, rational explanations, you're like, that actually makes less sense.
Yeah.
Then yeah, like you're saying, like this attitude of, oh well, the police are overreacting. Okay. In the same way that in the Battersea case, there was at one point Shirley was due to appear on the BBC,
yes,
on a programme, and one of the most famous and iconic TV broadcasters in British history was interviewing her beforehand, and and the sound happened, the banging started happening, and he was absolutely scared out of his mind. And then he never talked about it until he wrote his or it was biography or autobiography towards the end of his life, where he mentioned it. And he's such a well-respected and analytical and like rational person that had he probably come out and said something about that at the time, it might have lended credence to the story. But it's incredible how many people would use, so say like you're saying, like the police officers. So police officers would be thought to be, quite practical. And so if they'd said that they'd investigated it and they believed it was actually just this instead, people would go, yes, absolutely, because they're the police, so they've probably seen this sort of thing before, quite rational, they've explained it away. But then when the police when the same people from the same category report something paranormal, they're then like, no, they were overreacting, it's just nonsense, they just didn't know what they thought they saw, maybe they'd been at work all night, maybe they were tired, they were on the back shift. Like, people, let's make up your mind. Are these people who are supposed to be pinnacles of rationality, when they explain something away, they're yes, absolutely, and then but when they report something paranormal or they confirm or corroborate reporting of an event, suddenly they're tired, or they're just overreacting or whatever, or things like that. Like, you can't just pick and choose whose evidence to believe or who to give credence to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the ones that always gets on my nerves is when people are accused of drinking to the point of hallucination, Evelyn. And I've seen that trotted. It doesn't happen so much these days because I think it's very easy to find out just how much alcohol it would take for people to hallucinate. And essentially you are at the point of death when you were at this point. Or basically you have been a cast iron alcoholic for, the best part of your lives. And I remember, fairly recently, there was a show on Discovery Channel, I think last year, talking about monsters, and it was discussing the Hopkinsville Goblins case, which is one of my favourite alien encounter cases, which was basically a family that were besieged by weird goblin-looking aliens floating about and trying to get into their house. And the witnesses included 3 women and 4 children. And one of the skeptics, who's a very well-known skeptic, said during this segment on this case that a police officer had told him off the record that the bin was full of beer cans. So his excuse for everybody seeing these things, that everybody was that drunk, including the children, that they were hallucinating.
Amazing. That is like, the children are absolutely hoolit and they started seeing goblins. Like, what absolute nonsense. Like being, not just like being Scottish, but probably just being who I am. Like, I can put Scotch away like nobody's business. Listen, I make Charles Bukowski look like a nun, and I have never hallucinated anything. Like, I would love to do this experiment where we just get a table and put it in an empty room. We line up 3 bottles of single malt and 2 packs of smokes, and I'll drink them on camera, and we'll see if I hallucinate anything. Never. Do you know what I mean? Like, I have never seen goblins, and and I have been thoroughly paralytic.
Yes.
It's just absolute nonsense. And also beer. Like, yes, he had. You've had. I mean, how much? Like, even if it was like, full of beer cans. So assuming there's some rubbish on the bottom. So even if it's like a third full at the top, that's like probably 2 24-packs. So what's that?
Yeah.
Like 48. So, and there's a mum and a couple of kids and things like that. So if you divided it between them, so what they've had, like however many cans each, and then they all somehow saw goblins. Like, what? Even if you were drinking like Tennent's Super or whatever, it's unlikely. It's just not. I've nowhere in history. People can be drunk, and definitely because they're drunk, they're confused. They don't really understand what's going on. Memory impairment, absolutely, but not hallucinations, and not like that. Being so drunk that you thought something happened that didn't happen, or you misinterpreted something, surely, but not, a whole family seeing something or experiencing something, and apparently, they were all drunk. They all had the same this whole shared hallucination thing absolutely boils my, insert your own word there. Shared hallucination, absolute garbage. It just what does happen is that you get a group of people. It happens at car accidents are actually one of the worst ones for it, where something happens and somebody says, all right, I saw the red car cut off the blue car, and they collided. And then a bunch of people standing by on the side of the street, one person, they come up and they're like, oh, what happened? And the person, tells them that version of the story, and then so on and so forth, and they tell the whole crowd, and then the police, interview witnesses, and they all say, yeah, that's what happened, even though one of them actually saw that's what happened, and it kind of kind of creates like Chinese whispers down through the group. That absolutely happens. It happens very often. It's a difficulty in eyewitness reports and things like that. But the group hallucination thing, where there's like, in that case, just is so deeply unlikely, and the way it would have to happen, and fear does play a big part, and fear coupled with, eyewitness problems can definitely create issues, but it doesn't create people, like in the Battersea case, like nobody is having a group hallucination for 12 years.
Yes.
And for it to be like a group hallucination, if you have a small number of people, like 3, maybe 4 people or whatever, who can maybe get freaked out, psych themselves out, think they're hearing things, get really panicky, come running out of the house, really, really mess with each other, sure. But not like 50, 100 people who are coming in and out of places or investigating things, everybody from like the police to the fire brigade to an insurance assessor to family friends to neighbourhood to well-respected icons of British journalism, things like that, over the pan of like 12 years. Like, that's not a shared hallucination. Do you know what I mean? That's nonsense. And definitely the idea of people have had 10 cans and therefore they hallucinated an entire experience. Also, their children were also hula as well, and therefore that's what they saw. It's just nonsense. The stuff that people come up with to explain these things away is actually mind-blowing.
Yeah. As an ex-landlord of 13 years, Evelyn, and I knew some people that could really put it away. Nobody ever reported seeing anything in any pub I've owned when they were tanked up, So nobody leaves the pub and sees UFOs everywhere. It's just one of those things that it just harks back to, for me, the early days of cinema, where somebody would see something weird and they'd always be drinking something and they'd look at the bottle and go, "Oh," you know what I mean? And it's like, even in this day and age, people still use that as a valid excuse, and it's a very frustrating, I think is the politest way I can describe it, version of an explanation.
It definitely feeds back into the class thing as well that we were talking about earlier, because there's they were wrecked, or they live in a council estate and they probably had too many tins or whatever and things like that. But if the same thing had happened at like a Georgian townhouse, nobody would be like, well, how much is, Sir Feather, whatever, I don't know, posh people are always called something Feather or whatever. How much is Feather Higginbottom had to drink this evening? Like, nobody is checking how much port's still left in the decanter in the library in the East Wing.
Yes.
It's just an automatic assumption that if you've seen something and you were of a certain class, then you were probably on drink, you were probably on drugs. But I can guarantee you that you will find more drugs in a gated neighbourhood than you will on any council estate. It's just that it's not investigated and it's not looked at. And we automatically map that assumption onto these people because this crap is drilled into us by TV shows like Benefit Street and other stuff. It's poverty porn.
Yes.
And it's poverty safari and poverty porn, and it's drilled into us, and then these people are all nonsense and they're all idiots and they're all off their face and things like that. And it's just absolutely ridiculous. There's worse things happening behind gated driveways than there is on any high-rise block of land. And it's just completely fed into us the entire time, and we make these fantastical ways of explaining away people's experiences because we don't see them as being intellectual enough for them to have any validity at all.
Absolutely. It's the failure to be educated enough to comprehend things, I think, is often blamed on a majority of these situations, especially when it comes to the paranormal, as we've referred to, because most of the famous poltergeist cases, it's often brought forward that there's some kind of family tension. Like Battersea, you've got it doesn't seem stressful, but you would imagine you've got, 5 people living in a confined area. Enfield, divorce, children with difficulties at school and the breakdown of a family unit. Pontefract, there was an issue in regards to the family unit and tension and things like that. And once again, it's often that kind of thing that's prescribed to, well, you know what these people are like.
Yeah, and at Enfield as well, because obviously the dad had left or run off or whatever he was doing. So there is definitely, I find that there's a tone of, when they're assessing it, the Enfield case, there's an attitude of, oh, well, if the dad's not in the picture, so the kids are playing up. Yes. And if he was here, this would never be happening, and they just need proper discipline, and the mum's incapable and she's raised them really badly and things like that. Yeah. And, it's improper parenting, and the kids are smashing up the house, and that would never happen in my house, and all this sort of attitude. Definitely, like, family roles, I definitely come into it. And although we can see why kids would play up when they're in really stressful situations, and that 100% does happen, and they act out. But there's such a distinct difference between kids, acting out and becoming stroppy, or maybe being destructive or purposely misbehaving, because they're angry or they're hurting, probably mostly because they're hurting, or possibly because they think they're not getting enough attention from one parent, or they're trying to assert control, maybe when they don't feel like they have control at the moment. Yeah. But there's a huge difference between that and, like, creating, a poltergeist case. Like, it's just kids being moody and picking arguments and staying out and maybe going to get drunk with their pals in the park, or, graffiti, or, being lippy or whatever, is totally normal and totally fine. But there's no way that kid isn't pulling out an iron grate out of a wall at 3 o'clock in the morning, or creating disembodied voices, or running around the house, smashing it up and painting stuff on the ceiling somehow without using a stepladder, and setting fire to the house with their, their siblings in it, for banter, basically. What? That's not, that doesn't happen. That's absolute nonsense.
Yeah, very much so. Well, I think the last thing I'd like to touch on with you as well is, obviously, you've an upcoming lecture with the marvellous Sir Arthur Conan Doyle Centre, focusing on something that I find a very interesting aspect of the paranormal, which is objects, haunted objects, or objects that are classed as enchanted. So is that something that you've kind of developed an interest in through your exposure to the paranormal, Evelyn, or is it something that is one of those aspects or a facet of this subject that doesn't often get looked into, because, once again, people tend to sort of pigeonhole it as just superstitious nonsense?
I think it's definitely more the sort of second one. Haunted or enchanted or cursed or whichever objects are of real interest to me, because they are something that I feel is not discussed in the literature. I would be going out cataloguing or investigating places or researching things or exploring mostly, and when we'd be looking into the history of these places, sometimes a specific object would come up in the case, or a specific object would come up in this kind of folklore in the history of it. And then as I was into more of these places, I kept finding a pattern of there being a singular object or a singular item. And it occurred to me that there's no real compendium of haunted or cursed objects. There definitely will be. There's probably books on ones in specific folklore, or maybe even country or histories or things like that. But it's something that's kind of overlooked. We're really interested in the buildings, which a haunted house is essentially a type of haunted object. Yes. But because it's so large, we're obsessed with haunted houses and haunted places and haunted bars and things like that. But we don't really look at the individual, the smaller things, more like items. So I started to kind of dig into them. And then when Lance, who's the head of the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle Centre, asked me if I wanted to do a lecture, the obvious choice would be for me to lecture on, the quantum physics of anomalous phenomena, or talk about the consciousness problems in psychology, like the science of ghosts. We find ourselves talking about that so often now in terms of science, and I was like, well, what is something that people don't really look at or talk about? So I said to him, I would like to do a lecture on haunted and enchanted objects. So that's that's what I'm getting ready to do. And specifically in kind of, Scottish history and folklore, because we just have such a ridiculous amount of folklore and paranormal history.
Yes.
And I found there is quite a lot, but I was looking to do sort of like 3 from Enchanted and sort of 3 cursed objects, but not just, what is the actual folklore and mythology of the object, but also perhaps why these objects, how did they come to be enchanted or cursed or haunted or whichever. And also how significant are they in terms of the anthropology and sort of paranormal anthropology of these objects, because we sometimes find that it's not just an object that has a legend attached to it, it's just it's a interesting piece of folklore, or therefore it maybe draws like tourist attraction or things like that. But also some of these objects actually had significant influence on history. Some of them were treated with such regard that they influenced political climate at the time. They influenced wars, or they altered the actions of like religious groups, which also then again like feeds back into politics. They're monumentally important things, and I think we just kind of ignore them. The only time we sort of think of haunted or cursed object is we think of the bloody like Warren's, museum of like kind of haunted object collection and things like that. We think of them being in poltergeist cases or almost like trophies from paranormal events.
Yeah.
We don't think of them as being socio-political or anthropologically interesting artifacts, and like paranormal archaeology doesn't seem to really be a thing, and so we've kind of overlooked them, and I'm really interested in them, not just in terms of the folklore and psychology and anthropology, but also in terms of the scientific makeup of them. Like we see in haunted cases that objects that were thrown by supposed poltergeist change weight, and this happens in it's been reported in so many cases. And so if something interacts with something else, whatever it may be, does it change its molecular structure? Is it altered in some ways, or is it entangled in some other way in terms of molecular entanglement?
Yeah.
Is it forever changed? Can it no longer be separated? So what is the actual physical makeup of these objects? What gives them the supposed power of them? But I just feel like it's an incredibly overlooked part of the paranormal. We're so obsessed with ghosts and poltergeists and people and and the drama of it all, and we've kind of forgotten that cursed and haunted objects are somehow kind of creepier actually, because a house must remain on the land but an object can travel anywhere.
Yeah, very true. I went to a folklore conference a couple of years ago here in Sheffield, which was marvellous, and we had a wonderful variety of topics covered. And one of those was by Dr. David Clarke, who discussed the Crying Boy paintings, Evelyn, which was a massive phenomenon, which, if you don't know much about it, actually started in Sheffield, where a house caught fire, and obviously the only thing that seemed to remain undamaged in the room that caught fire was this picture. And obviously you had this massive furore at the end of the 80s of, I think even The Sun went on this kind of campaign asking people to send all their paintings into them, and they would burn them for everybody to be safe. And obviously it garnered some kind of urban legend to it. These paintings were cursed, and yet when you look at the society at the time, things like chip pans were being used, which I still find a very weird thing. I was explaining it to somebody who wasn't British the other day, and they were just like, "What? You had a boiling pan of fat on a cooker?" Like,
yeah, we still do that. Like, I still do that.
I'm sticking with my air fryer these days. But and that essentially was down to the fact of how things worked in those days, and also the actual wood that these paintings were on was highly inflammable. It just wouldn't burn. And yet, cursed pictures.
Yeah, I think we have to look at really the it's with the sort of when we break apart the actual materials of what something is made up of, in terms of like objects being just supposedly cursed or doing things like they used to line top hats with mercury, and that's where the term Mad Hatter comes from, and it drove people crazy. Yes. But you could do that with a hat and be like, this hat is cursed. It will, anybody who wears it goes crazy and starts screaming, but nobody at the time was able to test it. Go, okay, well, mercury is actually poisonous.
Yes.
It makes you incredibly ill. So there is often, structural explanations for these things, but it's weird that sometimes we don't think to, like, one of the first things we should do when we're investigating these things is go, okay, well, let's look at the environmental, like, potential causes or reasoning. And it's almost basically step one in a case, but it's incredible how many people don't do it. But then also, I guess, on the flip side of that, it's incredible how many things we go, oh yeah, it's really weird that this one thing was at the centre of X amount of phenomena. It's probably not that. Like, we'll just kind of ignore that. And probably nothing.
Yeah, move on. Yeah,
nothing to see here. Look over there.
Absolutely. Well, Evelyn, listen, it's been fabulous to have a proper chat with you. Like I say, I'm very impressed with the way you work and the way you analyse things, and I think you've got a bright future, and I hope one day we have the opportunity to talk again about any variety of subjects, because we've not really delved into quantum physics and energy and is consciousness molecular, so I think we might save all those for another day perhaps. Where can everybody keep up to date and follow your work and see what you're up to next?
So I'm on Twitter, so _ Evelyn Hollow. I'm on Instagram, just at Evelyn Hollow. I also have a website as well, www.evelynhollow.com. And so there's links to sort of writing work and articles and things on that. I actually need to update it. But mostly probably for keeping in touch with things like television shows and podcasts, definitely Twitter, probably just, seeing what stupid stuff I'm up to, probably Instagram. But I'm on pretty much anywhere on social media, and I post pretty regularly, so.
Yeah, absolutely. I always look out for your drink recommendations on Instagram, I have to say. Many a beer crosses my feed, and I think, I've not tried that one. Let's see if I can track it down. So
I do, professional alcoholic at this point.
Well, I think that's one thing Yorkshire and Scotland have in common, Evelyn. So long may it bring us together rather than push us apart, my love.
Yeah.
Well, listen, it's been a real pleasure to speak to you, Evelyn. Thank you so much for your time today, and all the very best in future, and hopefully we'll speak again.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure. Hopefully we'll get to do it again at some point.